I'm grown up enough and I've done enough of this work that I'm like, my absolute resistance to that idea means I should take a look.
Right.
Like, I should go figure out what that resistance is.
Hello, and welcome to the 40 Drinks podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie McLaughlin. You know, sometime in the years around our 40th birthday, many of us start to feel what I call the ick. Like some part of your life that had been working well no longer works, and you don't know what to do about it. I know that was true for me, and I fought against it, which only made it a messier process. But having 40 drinks with 40 people over the course of a year helped me escape the influence of that ick. On this podcast, I welcome you to tap into my stories and experience, as well as those of my guests, to help you emerge from your own ick, and maybe even avoid some of the mistakes we made along the way. My mission is to make it common cultural knowledge that there is a transition most of us face around age 40, and then showcase so many versions of that transition that every single person approaching or recently turned 40 with dread in their heart knows that they are not alone. Today, my guest is Marc Scheff, who, when he turned 40, was threatened on the streets of New York City by a couple of construction workers after he stuck up for a woman they were catcalling at. That left him shaken, and it's what got him into jitsu, which changed his life, his fitness level, and his outlook. Then, a few years later, he manifested a dream project that ultimately didn't work out and had to work his way through that disappointment, loss, and identity crisis. Hey, Marc, welcome to 40 Drinks.
Thanks for having me, Stephanie. It's great to be here.
It's my pleasure. I started that way today specifically. Welcome to 40 Drinks. Usually I just say thanks for being here. But one of the things that you and I identified it when we first chatted was that you started getting hangovers at 35.
Oh, man. It's like rubbing salt in the wound. Yeah.
I know.
It's not that I never had a hangover before 35. In my 20s and in my college years, I grew up in a very strict household. I was very focused on school education. When I went off to college, suddenly I didn't have any rules. And I did, I would say, get into drinking. I didn't really know where the limit was. I was fortunate enough to find that limit, and I didn't become an alcoholic, but also I had gotten a hangover or two. But at 35, suddenly, I'd be working. And at that time, I was doing a lot of artwork. 5, 6 o'clock, it'd be like the end of the day. Let's chill out. I'd have my glass of whiskey, one rock, really just kind of loved it just so. And even with just one glass, and sometimes it was two, I'd wake up the next day feeling a little like, just that kind of like a twinge. Kind of, like it wasn't like I woke up and I was like, oh my God, I regret my life, but just sort of like, I'm not really at full capacity right now.
To me, it was, and I always got hangovers. I was very similar to you, very strict growing up, went to college, started drinking, very quickly went pro and stayed pro for a long time. But it was like just as soon as I started drinking like a reasonable person, I started getting hangovers for just that, like the 1 or 2 glasses of wine with dinner or the one cocktail for happy hour kind of thing. I was like, for crying out loud.
Yeah, and it's not that it wasn't manageable, but it was also around that time. And I'd been doing personal growth work, broad strokes, for 10, 12 years. I'd been doing it for a while at that time. And, just sort of got to a point where I'm like, am I holding myself back in some way? Now, look, I still think booze is great. Cocktails are having a real heyday right now, especially, I'll have a sip of my wife's drink if it's tasty, but I don't have a drink. And at the times that I have, there was an article ages ago. I wish I could find it. You can probably Google it, but it was a guy who wrote about the 12-step programs and just mostly how he was like, I just don't really buy into this. It's great for some people. They need the structure. But he's like, I don't buy the idea that if I have, if I go out for drinks one night that I'm like resetting the clock, back to zero. And he said, I call it research, not relapse. I really, really liked. Or maybe I just wanted to like it. But, I have had a drink in the last 7 years and I have not at any point gone, that enhanced my experience in such a way that I'm willing to give up my sleep and all the other things that start to happen when you are pushing 40, past 40. It's a terrible thing to realize that taking care of your health is actually good for you.
I know. It's so funny. I like research versus relapse. Within the last year, I was down in Boston with my best friend who was my biggest drinking buddy for many years. He's now in recovery. And I don't know, I think we'd gone out to an event and afterwards we're like, let's just go to one of our old haunts just for the fun of it. It was a Saturday night. We're feeling the energy and we walked in, the place was crazy slammed. And this young girl came up and started chatting with us, and we both have sparkling water in our hands. And she sort of said something about a drink, and I said something, and my best friend goes, no, 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 she's retired and I'm recovering.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you said you went pro and now now you're
Right.
retired.
Now I'm retired. Now I'm retired. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, there's just no big payout at the end when you,
Right.
except for you're not tired or as tired. I mean, that's the other thing is like how much of this is just I'm pushing 40, and how much is actually what I'm doing. We had a friend over who's visiting from California. She comes here once a year for Climate Week, and we get the annual visit, which is awesome. It's like a little tradition we have, and we'll have lunch at our house. And we were just sort of talking about like all these things that start to happen, hopefully, not until you're older, but we were talking about some things that have happened to people when they were younger. And you're like, do I need to go see a doctor or am I just 40?
Right.
Is this chronic fatigue? Should I be worried? Or like, am I just tired?
Oh, the indignities of getting older, for sure. For
Yeah.
sure. Oh, let's go back though, because I sort of started us off on a weird direction, which I love. But tell me a little bit about the forces that shaped you to be who that guy was at 35, when you started getting hangovers and then coming up to 40. Who were you?
Yeah. It's a good question. And just, I want to put it in context because something I think about a lot. I know there's a framework for this and I know someone invented it and I just can't think of who, but there's this idea that we kind of live our lives in cycles and, maybe it's like a woo woo thing. I don't know, but it
Mm.
really kind of fits my narrative. About every 7 years,
Yep.
I go through some sort of change professionally, personally. And, you can almost think about it like when you're growing up, like 0 to 7 is kind of like a stage. 7 to 14 in
Yep.
some ways is another stage. 14 to 21 is definitely another. For me, I grew up in Boston, Brookline, just out on the train. For those who are keeping score. But I also went to school in Boston. I went to Harvard, so I didn't go very far. So here I am, spent 21, 22 years. I was ready to go somewhere. So here's that 7 year itch, so to speak, and I go to California.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm also trying to be an adult and I'm paying rent and trying to figure out who I am as an adult, as opposed to not out of the house, but not that far from the house. And still
Right.
like my parents paid for school. Thank you, parents. And so here I like, it's another stage. And, that stage was a time of huge change for me. It's where I first got introduced to this kind of personal growth where even like, what does that even mean?
Mm-hmm.
That 7 years was a really big shift for me. I did not grow up in a family that was very introspective. My dad's a pediatrician. My mom pretty much was a stay-at-home mom. She was a nurse when she met my dad, but very focused on like you get your career and you do this thing. There's like a path that you're sort of supposed to take, but things were really changing. This is the late 90s, remember? So the idea that you did any one thing for a very long time was really getting turned on its head. In fact, my first, I want to say 3 years, I had 4 or 5 different jobs because again, this is the first tech crash. So
Yeah.
through no fault of my own, I kept joining companies that 3 months later would go under
Yeah.
and I would be on to the next one. I was very lucky and I could sometimes read the writing on the wall and get to the next thing. And, but at some point I had the opportunity. I went back to art school. So this is a time of great change. Now that takes you through what, 28. So the next 7 years to 35, there's some parts of my life that have kind of settled down. I was part of a men's circle in San Francisco that was a really grounding, very
Mm.
educational, very grounding. This is where I first really got introduced to people who were coaches,
Yep.
and this is literally 20 years ago. Is the first time I walked out and, onto the beach with this group. And, I was also doing some other work. I was then, living in a community of friends that I loved, and we threw events. Some of them were
Yep.
illegal. We'd go to Burning Man and build these big camps. And it was like this beautiful time of my own growth, of developing these friendships, and also meeting my wife, who was a part of that community, and moving to New York. And between 28 and 35, I met my wife. I moved to New York where she was. We had a kid. And so here I am at 35. My wife is sort of working her way through legal fellowships at this point. We're sort of finding our feet here in New York.
Yep.
And there's not as much like everything could change. Like I could move, I could do, like I have a kid. I'm not probably just moving because of a
Right.
job or anything else. So there's more roots.
Mm-hmm.
right? 35, I've got more roots. And I think with that, there's also more of a sense of like, well, how do I take care of myself? Because I want to be around for this kid, first of all, that's a big thing. But I also want to be around for myself. And you start to feel there are changes that start to happen. You are a little more tired, and
Yeah.
cuts don't heal as fast. I remember when I turned 40, it was like almost like right when I turned 40, I had like a cut on my finger. I forget. It was a little thing. And I remember looking down and it was still there 2 weeks later. I'm like, that's weird. This should be gone by now. Like in my 20s, you're like, oh, I have a cut. That'll be gone, by the weekend.
Tomorrow. Yeah.
Right. But like 2 weeks later, I'm like, I'm still wearing a Band-Aid on this. That's crazy. But yeah, I think there was a little bit of that. And not everybody like follows that path and has those roots and settles down or whatever. But I think there's
Right.
also something biological that's like, okay, so you did a whole bunch of stuff that your body was able to take care of.
Mm-hmm.
And now what's your long-term plan? What's your
Yep.
marathon plan? How are you going to be doing this?
Yeah. And that comes at different times. I mean, for me, I didn't start getting grounded and calm until I was about 40. And I didn't have kids, and I had strings of terrible romantic relationships, and was very extroverted and very much in the business community and the social community, and like always out and doing things, and very active and vibrant. And similarly had a big group of friends that we would plan events and weekends and trips and all the stuff. But it wasn't until I was 40 that I started to really kind of feel a little bit more grounded in myself, and some of that external stuff started to fall away, because looking back, it was almost compulsive. The
Okay.
outness, the being out and the doing things and the events and the happy hours and the socials, all of that stuff. So yeah, I definitely felt a little bit of that too, in a little bit of a different way. That grounding, that settling, not
Right.
settling for, like not settling for the wrong thing, but
Right. Not
settling into
settling into.
myself.
I mean, we obviously have two very different experiences in terms of like family structure, right? So I
And
think
yet
what I'm
some commonality in experience.
right, and that's so interesting, right? Because I think there's something that someone might assume is like, well, he's a dad, and so like obviously things slow down. But at the same time, I think there's something you've read about this, I've read about this, but there's something that kind of happens when you're hitting midlife
Yeah.
where you start to think about you have a conscious experience of the last 20 or 30 years, maybe
Yes.
not the first 10 or 15, maybe you don't remember that,
Right.
but I remember most of the things that happened between say 20 and almost 48. And I can say, oh well, if I remember that much, well, I could sort of think about what the next 30 years looks like and actually have a concept of how much time that is. And
Yeah.
I could actually do something about that. I think something that happens is we start to think, whether we like it or not, about kind of what could we create long term. And that's a very confronting thing. And
Yeah.
I think one of the outcomes, which I love that you've had, it sounds like, and I still, I think we're all still working on this, but is that kind of like, okay, how do I sustain this?
Mm-hmm.
Because something else is like, I don't go party all night every weekend. I don't do a lot of the things that I was able to do in my 20s, and I don't want to completely be like, well, I'm done with that. Like I still want to go to campouts with my friends. I
Yep.
still want to go out and get out of the house and do these things. It's harder now, and some of that is just me, and some of it is the age thing. But like I started, and anyone who knows me is going to laugh because they know exactly what I'm going to say. Is I started jujitsu at age
Right.
41. I love
Even I
talking
know
about it. I think it's like this really fantastic thing. And I love starting something new like that and really developing a strong practice around it. And I say strong practice, that's not like I'm the best at jiu-jitsu. I'm not. I'm
right.
factually not. But my practice is strong. I show up. And
Yeah.
having something new like that, like I'm sort of looking forward to, my early 50s. And I'm like, okay, so other than jujitsu, which I probably hopefully will just continue until my body completely breaks. But like, is there another thing that I might be a total beginner at, which is good?
Yeah.
Like, that's something that really feeds me. I love being in those spaces where I'm kind of like, well, I haven't done this before. I wonder if I
Mm-hmm.
could, figure it out. I mean, the whole title of this thing was like a project that came out of something like that.
Right. Right. And it's interesting too, because I love that you picked up jujitsu at that time. I picked up aerial circus, aerial silks
Okay.
when I was about 41, which is like a weird time to do that. Like the people who are doing it are usually much, much younger. But I grew up in a ballet studio, and there was something about the silks that had a very commonality with the ballet that I grew up in. And I loved it for many years. I did it for many years until I got sick to the point where I couldn't do it anymore. But I loved it. And to your point, I was not very good at it, but I showed up because I loved it. It felt good in my heart. It didn't feel good in my body because it was very hard, but
Yeah.
it felt very good in my heart. And so that was really fulfilling. But also, as a small business owner, it was the kind of thing where I had to be 150% present, or
Mm,
else I would drop myself on my head. So you couldn't be thinking about something that someone on your team did, or one of your clients did, or the job you didn't get, or the job you did get and now you got a plan for. Like, you just had to be 150% present on the silks, or otherwise you're going to hurt yourself really bad.
right. Or in my case, somebody's going to choke you unconscious. But
Right. Well, there's that.
right, right.
But one of the things I love about jujitsu is that it comes about as part of this 40 transition. Will you tell me the story of like how you got into jujitsu and why?
I forget if I told you all the details
You
before.
told me some of them, but I think it's part of this transition. So I love this.
It is in a way. I want to ask you about the ballet thing because you kind of like skirted
Yeah.
past that. So my kids were doing jujitsu, and I could not tell you why we were having them do jujitsu. There was a school in Brooklyn that was like a very popular school for kids, and we were like, they need an activity. It's close to school. Okay, we'll just do that. But it was a little bit of a pain in the ass to get to. Around this time, they'd been doing jujitsu for a little while, and it was that time that I was basically threatened on the street a couple times. There's one time that these three construction workers were walking by my house, literally right in front of my house, and they started catcalling this lady who's walking the other way. And I kind of was like, guys, don't do that. And they were like, what? And then I ran into them I was going for a run. I ran into them on the way back, and I made the mistake of trying to talk to them again because I don't know what's wrong with me. And I
Yeah.
wanted them to know, like, I don't think they're bad people. And they were like, I think his words were, I'm about to punch you through this parked car. And the only thing I had in my toolkit at that point was the word, please don't. So fortunately, he did not. And I walked away unscathed. But it was around that same time I had another incident with this dad at my school. So I come home one day and we had someone who was picking up our daughter and bringing her home from school. She comes home, I come home, and I see her, and she's like visibly like shaking, and I'm like, whoa, what's like, something is going on, what happened? She told me that this dad at school really ripped into her, really let it, and I was like, that's not cool. I will talk to him and find. So I went and I was like, hey, like, my nanny was like pretty freaked out the other day. Can you want to tell me what happened? And he went like full on like white dude mansplaining. He was like, oh, well, you got to understand like what my day was like. I'm like, I don't have to understand what your day was like.
Right.
That was not appropriate. But he like mansplained to me. And in the process of doing this, he was also telling me about how he practices jujitsu, which is a very weird flex in that kind of conversation.
Yeah.
I realized later. But me, just the way my mind operates, I was like, oh, you do jujitsu? Wait, is that close by? So I switched my kids to this school. So now I'm going by this school all the time, and the owner's really nice. And at one point, the construction thing happened, and he was like, you should try a class. You should just try a class. And he told me, he's like, look, learning this is not going to necessarily make you better in a street fight. It's going to help you stay out of the street fights. And I knew what he meant even at the time. But as I've gotten deeper and deeper into the practice, I don't think it's any more complicated than like, you just get really good at leaving your ego at the door. Someone wants to fight me in the street, I'm going to walk away, or I'm
Yeah.
just going to avoid you. I don't feel like less of anything to be like, I'm going to walk around that. I'm going to not engage that.
I have this vivid picture in my head. Are you a fan of Grosse Point Blank, the movie?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
John Cusack
Certain
in the
moral
hallway.
flexibility.
But the John Cusack in the hallway when the big bully comes up at him and like starts like you and me, man, we're gonna we're gonna fight, and he goes, listen, there is no you and me. Like, he just diffused it so easily by just saying like, whatever's in your head doesn't exist. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at with that ego piece.
I mean, if you are in this practice, look, people do it all kinds of ways. I know that there's people out there who are doing MMA and they have big, and like, fine. And you see some of them on TV. But I think my experience in the schools that I've been a part of is that for the most part, when you find your crew, like, that goes away. It kind of has to. I mean, one of my favorite things is to work with people, and I'm a purple belt now, so I'm like, I know some things, and I'll work with blue belts and white belts, and we're just sort of like, okay, well, let's explore. Like, yes, maybe I could, tap, or maybe they could like crush me 15 times, but that's not interesting. We're
Right.
not there to do that. We're not a school that's really focused on competition, but we have a lot of people who do compete. We're also there to learn. And
Yeah.
that's what I love about this activity, or, like you with the fabric, with the circus stuff. Like, I don't imagine that you joined it and you were like, I'm going to go join Cirque du Soleil. Like, I don't think, right?
No. Oh, no. As a matter of fact, when I first started, and I mean this in just the silliest way possible, one of the earliest things they do is you tie the silk in a knot. So you've basically got something that's a U there, right? And you put it around your waist, and
Yeah,
then you tip yourself back and you put your legs out wide and you hang upside down. And it's sort of one of the very earliest
I can
things
see
that
it.
and
Yeah.
it's lovely. But I used to say, my fat hurts. Because all of your weight, 100% of your weight is being held by whatever size spare tire you have.
A spare tire.
Yeah. And then, after a couple of weeks, it's like, it's not quite so bad, right? It's like anything else. You acclimate to the different pain, I guess,
Right.
to the different movements.
But I'm sure
Yeah.
that's an ego diffuser on whatever
Big
level.
time. Big time. Like, no matter how good you think you are when you walk in the door, like you tilt back into your first straddle back and you go, oh.
Are you still doing that or no?
I'm not. I've been managing a couple of chronic illnesses for a few years and I just haven't had the strength to go
The
back.
other the other thing that happens, yeah.
Yeah, I would love to go back someday. That is a goal of mine, is to get back someday and get back in those silks and have some fun, because boy, did I
Well,
love it.
well, I mean, so I started at 40, and even when I started at 41, I still felt like I had a lot of energy, and I was like, I was a spazzy white belt. That's what we call them, right? Like, I had a lot of energy, and I was like trying to get out of like all this stuff, and combination of age and experience, but definitely. I have to, like, you saw me probably just put down my heating pad because I've injured my knee. Nobody else injured it. I did something that was a totally fine move, actually, and my knee was like, not today. And also, you're screwed for a couple of weeks. So
Right.
I'm nursing this injury, and so here's the thing: I want to keep doing this.
Yeah.
And so I have to find ways to do it. Like, I can't do it the way that I was doing it, even at 41. That was 7 years ago. Like, I can't do it that way. So I have to find ways emotionally and physically. But it's a
Yeah.
lot of, a lot of it, I think, for people is emotionally. Is like, you see a lot of people kind of leave jujitsu or, these other things, not because of physical stuff necessarily, but because they are getting older. They can't do it exactly the way they were doing it. And so they sort of quit altogether.
Yeah, the
I think,
reality no longer meets their expectation.
right.
They thought.
This
Yeah.
kind of gets into some of the mindset and coaching stuff that I do, but there is a very real tendency that I've seen with a lot of people, creatives or activists, people who are working to make a better world, broad strokes, is that, if I can't quite get it exactly the way that I want it, then it's not worth doing.
Right.
And I say that's a bunch of BS. I just think,
Right.
because as we get older, there's some things that we're going to be able to do better and better.
Yeah.
But also there's going to be some things that, like, like, I don't have the energy to, like, I used to sleep, not very much, and I'd have all these projects and I could stay up.
Right.
I would pay for it. I'd be a not very nice person. I'd likely
Yep.
be divorced.
Yep.
I'd be estranged from my kids. Like, it would be bad. I'm at a stage of my life in the past, especially the past couple of years, again, about to be 48. So I'm optimizing for sleep in my life right now.
Yes.
That all I'm trying to, absolutely, like, be the best at what I do in as much as I can in the world of coaching, in the world of jujitsu. Like, I am being my personal best, which is not to say the best, but like my personal best.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, I optimize for sleep. That's it.
Yeah. And it's interesting, right? Because it's about priorities shifting. And it's about,
Yeah.
this transition that we go through at midlife. In our 20s and our 30s, our priorities are all about the things we've been told we should do, right? We should go to college. We should get a degree, a good job. We should get a career. We should build a relationship. We should get married. We should. And so we put much of our time and energy and intention around just going down that path and working, digging. And then what happens here at midlife is we actually pick our head up and realize like, oh, I've been working so hard on all the things I was supposed to be doing, and this is where I got, and this is all
Right.
there is. And why aren't I happier? Why aren't I more fulfilled? And so our priorities shift
A very
because
smart person told me, I think the other week, that you realize that you are your own authority.
yeah.
How was Stephanie, you guys?
Oh, you're so kind. That's when, just so we know, that is when I was on Marc's podcast.
Coming soon. Coming
Coming
soon.
soon.
Hopefully be out by the time. That's really what I hear, is that you realize I am the boss of me, not because you want to be, but because that's just how it works.
Yeah. Once you take control of your own life, you take the reins, you stop following some pre-prescribed pathway and really dig into what it is that's important to you and what you value and what you want, things start changing a lot. The whole playing field changes.
How do you find out? I mean, I have some ideas, certainly, but like, this is a question I get a lot. Like, I'll ask people what they want. They're like, I don't know. Like, how do you find out, especially if you're also dealing with whatever feelings you're having about like not having figured it out, which I think are also made up. But
Yeah.
how do you figure out what it is that you want at this stage of life, which is obviously a very big question for a lot of people?
If I knew the answer to that question, Marc, I would have the $1 million already. No, I'm being a little flip. Hi, we'll get back to the conversation in just a minute. We're about halfway through this examination of midlife transition. And if you're enjoying Marc's story and finding comfort or a sense of camaraderie in his journey, then please hit subscribe, leave a review, or share this episode with a friend who might appreciate this insight into midlife's unexpected twists and turns. Who knows, maybe you'll help someone discover a part of themselves they've been searching for. And if you want to learn more about the 40 transition, please consider getting on my email list where I explore the topic in different ways than I do here in my guest episodes. You can do that on my website, 40drinks.com, spell out the word 40. There's a contact button right at the top of the page if you want to drop me a line, and a subscribe button if you want to get on that email list. All right, back to the show. One of the things that happens during this period, when we pick the head up and we realize I'm not as happy as they told me I would be, I'm not as fulfilled, I don't want this, we can detach ourselves from those expectations and from those pathways and those shoulds. And once we do that, I think what I've heard a lot of in all the interviews I've done is there becomes awareness, right? And awareness is very much the first step. This thing isn't working well. This thing isn't going well. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we start either hearing for the first time or tuning back into the little voices inside our bodies. Sometimes it's in our head, sometimes it's in our gut, sometimes it's a feeling, some people get it visually, intuition, instinct. Those voices, I'll call them voices, will say things to us that sound really scary because they are not the prescribed path. They are something different. And for me, I know that period of time where I started to become more grounded and I wasn't going out quite as much and I wasn't filling the hole with all this activity and sensory input, I was able to hear more and tune in a little bit more. And so really starting to listen to those voices, they're not going to steer you wrong. So whether it says, go for the promotion, don't go for the promotion, or whether it says blow up your career and start something different, right? And it's different for everybody, whether it's blowing something up or just making, course corrections. And it depends on how much we've been paying attention to date.
Yeah, something that you touched on, I think. So there's this thing called the formula for change, and it was invented by, I'm going to forget who, but it was a business concept. And it was popularized in the 80s by a woman professor or something. I'm going to forget all the names. I wrote about it somewhere. You can Google it. I didn't make it up. There's this idea that if we want to make any kind of change, and we're talking about transformational change in our careers, our personal lives, sort of any aspect of your life wheel, so to speak.
Mm.
And the formula kind of goes like this. If you want to make a change in your life, you're probably going to encounter resistance. That
Yep.
resistance can look like actual logistics, like moving or getting a new job. Like there's things that you have to do that are in the way, or just your own inner resistance. The voice is saying you're not good enough, or you have imposter syndrome, or just stick to where it's safe. You have this resistance. And in order to make a change, you have to overcome resistance. You have to have
Yep.
something that's bigger than the resistance, basically. And there's a lot of different frameworks for thinking about this that work for different people. One is if I want to move away from something, a crappy job, relationship, whatever, it's often not enough to just be like, I don't want that.
Right.
So one way of overcoming resistance, this is not the formula for change, is to create something for yourself on the other side. What am I moving to? It's always easier to, and again, I did this a lot in my 20s, right? It's always easier to leave a job when there's something, when you have one,
Yep.
when there's like a better thing that you're moving to. But the formula for change works a little differently. And there's a few indicators and ingredients, and it's a very simple formula. What you need is some amount of discomfort, dissatisfaction, right?
Yep.
I don't really like where this is. I don't like how this feels in my body. I don't, whatever. You need some sort of vision for the future. Now, that could be as simple as a small thing like a vision for how happy you are at work, or a different kind of relationship, or even a different kind of relating within your relationship. Like all these things can be part of a vision. Oftentimes, if when people ask, how do I create a vision? I say, think about whatever future time, 3 months, 12 months, and really think about what you're thinking, feeling, and doing.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right? It's your vision. There's no judgment. Do whatever you want. So anyway, you have discomfort, dissatisfaction, you have a vision, and you need some small first steps. You need a way to start. Without all three of those ingredients, it's very easy to let the resistance sort of take over. How many people do we know who are miserable and talk about it all the time, but don't do anything about it?
Right.
Maybe they're missing a vision. Maybe they're missing a first step.
Right.
So when you're talking about, when you were just telling that story, what I heard is like that sort of level of dissatisfaction. That's often the first indicator. And if you are paying attention,
Yes.
if you are in the practice of even just noticing, whether you journal or do a daily check-in at the end of the day, or if you meditate, or I don't meditate, like if you don't meditate, if you just like take time to, I get a couple of nice moments to myself when I'm going to and from dropping off my kid at school, and I'm on my little electric scooter and I'm going through the park. This is my moment to just be like, wow, let me just sort of let the thoughts unspool. And that's oftentimes for me a time of great sort of right brain connection and visioning.
Yeah.
I'm getting a little long in the tooth on this one, but you made me think about that formula for change. Yeah. And if any of those steps sound hard, especially vision or first steps, that's where getting support, whether you're paying for a coach or just have a good, friend who really gets you, and you can sort of talk through some of these things. And if you're open to exploring that, that's the really scary thing, though. That's the thing that most people get scared off by, is that if I start to look at this stuff, I'm going to have to change.
I had a friend, a mentor, a psychic many years ago, who in a similar situation said the positive of the future has to be bigger than the discomfort of whatever rut you're in. A rut can be really comfortable, and it can also be really irritating. And we can want to change, but the rut is real deep. And so the other side has got to be more attractive than however comfortable that rut is.
Yeah. And that's a really good way of thinking about it. So when you're coming up with the vision, it doesn't have to be big, like you want to change the world, but it has to be something there has to be something in there that you really want.
Yeah, and it's got to be attractive to you. It's got to be motivating to you.
And then the thing about those, you also need a way to start, because I really wish that my life were like this. Okay, well, how are you going to start? And it doesn't have to be, people are always like, I'll build this and I'll do this and I'll start this. And I'm like, no. Like when I talk about first steps, this is another thing that I think is really important for people to understand when they're like, I want to make a change. When I talk about first steps with my clients and my group work, I'm like, a first step is something that you can do that doesn't require anybody else in about 20 minutes or less. And they're like, what are you talking about 20 minutes? I'm like, I'm talking about sending an email. I'm talking about making a list of gyms near you. I'm talking about sitting and, doing an idea or a mood board, or making a piece of art. Like that's what I'm talking about with first steps. Because it has to be, first of all, it has to be easy. James Clear, author of Atomic Habits, would also argue, and I agree, that it would also should be something that's fun, that you're actually looking forward to doing in some way.
Yep.
Otherwise, you're probably not going to,
right. Otherwise, it's just more work.
Otherwise, it's just more work.
It's another obligation.
Yeah, I mean, this work of transformation, which is my world, but also the world of people in their midlife, whether you want it to happen or not, change is inevitable. You can engage with it or you can let it happen to you. I'd rather do a little bit of design work and maybe not get everything that I want than kind of, hope for the best.
Right. Very much like you, I grew up sort of not an introspective person. In fact, that has only come to me in the last couple of years. Really, since I've been doing this podcast, it's been wonderful for that part of my growth. I found at midlife, I was making messes of a lot of things because I had no concept of looking inward. Even though there was some personal growth in my path, it was esoteric and it was surface. So there was a lot underneath it that was still kind of messy. And so this transition really was a major surprise to me and a bit of a mess.
You told me, and I'm sure your listeners know the story of the 40 drinks at this. I'm hoping they know this
Yeah.
story. But one thing that stood out to me when you were telling me that story was how, I mean, I'm sure you were not going from zero self-reflection, but the way that you were having these conversations, like by design or by design accident, something. Anyway, you were
Yeah.
getting all of this reflection in a way that was kind of fun and really nourishing in a way.
Right. Right. Yeah, there were a number of things that surprised me and made me change how I saw myself during that project. But the important thing for me personally was it was all wrapped in this very silly bow that made it very easy for me to continue on the path because it wasn't onerous, it wasn't arduous, it wasn't work. It was very, very much play for me. And something I'm very extroverted. I love connecting with people. So, literally, finding a way to have drinks with 40 people over the course of a year was like one of the most fun things I could do. So there was definitely, I think mentioned it to you, it was like there was a spoonful of sugar element
Mm-hmm.
of I didn't know I was getting medicine until many, many, many steps in when all of a sudden the medicine started working. And it
Yeah.
was like, wait a minute, things are changing and shifting and what is going on? But you had some shifts too professionally in your world. Remind me a little bit about those. You had a professional situation that you
Oh,
thought was going
yeah.
to go one way and went another.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, I've been in the coaching world since, for 20 plus years. And it was around 2015 or 2014, I think I got some coaching for my art, and I worked with this coach, Rich Litfin. He's a very well-known person in the coaching world. If you're in the coaching world, you've heard his name. I got to work with him when he was arguably sort of starting out. So I
Sure.
got very lucky to get this great coach. And we worked together for a little while. I moved on to other things, but we did this exercise where he just called it the impossible game. It's not a very complicated thing. We came up with an idea for what my life might look like, what my legacy might look like, and I had to think of something that is impossible. And what does that mean? It means I have no idea how I'm going to do it.
Right.
There's things that I can think of that I want to do that I'm like, yeah, I don't know all the steps, but like I can kind of see. I had
Right.
to think of something where I'm like, that actually seems impossible. I'd have to be living a very different life up until this point to live. So we came up with this idea of creating, kind of a creative school that involved, also coaching and business education and all this other stuff. So put that away. Fast forward, COVID hits. I've just had one of the biggest shows of my life in Miami with, this gallery in Denver took me down there, a band gallery, great gallery. And COVID hits immediately afterwards. We move out of the city and I don't have my studio. I've got two kids at home. And my wife, who works in the world of she's trying to end mass incarceration. Remember, this is the summer of George Floyd. So
Right.
everything's on fire. Everything is on fire. Home, everything. And I was not making art. And then someone who we were having lunch with this person and she was, sort of saying, oh, I've got this property up here where we were near Woodstock. And she's like, I've got this property and I think I'm just going to get rid of it. I've got this nonprofit and I've got this property. I don't really know what to do with it. So I think I'm just going to like move. And I was like, connect.
Yeah.
I've got this idea. Can I tell you about it? She's like, sure, send me a pitch. So I sent her a pitch and she really liked it. And it really made sense with the kind of stuff that she wanted to do and bringing community together and supporting being radically inclusive and accessible in a number of very specific ways in the way that we were going to build out this art center and these art retreats. And we got started on that project. So I was now running this organization.
So
And
not quite impossible.
as it turns out, I mean, could I plan a way to meet a person with the
No.
money and resources to just back my project?
Yeah.
No. I mean,
Right.
that's impossible, except for because I had done the work to think about it and I kind of kept it in my back pocket. It was available when the opportunity came.
Right.
I wasn't also beating myself up and spending all my time going, where's the opportunity?
Right.
But it showed up and I was like, you know what? I'm going to ask about it. So I got to lead this organization, and not to put too fine a point on it, it did not end well. My relationship with the staff became very toxic. There was therapy involved for me and everybody. Like, it was just, it went really south in a way. Like, I can even feel my face getting heated because it was a very difficult experience. And again, without getting into the details, like, I got very depressed. We went through a bunch of sort of mediation and therapy. And at the end of the day, this person was sort of like, how do you want to continue? And I was like, I don't see a way for me to do that. Like, I really appreciate the support and that you want me to be employed, but I think that for my mental health, I've got to go. And then I was just in this deep, deep depression. So here we are in 20.
Makes perfect sense, right? This is your dream. This is your impossible dream. You have
Yeah.
created it, run it, and
Yeah.
then
Yeah. And I mean, it's that, and it fell apart, right?
yeah.
Like, here it was, and it slipped through my fingers. And I could see, like, if we could just get the machine to work right, like, we could do so much good together.
So close.
But there were people there who just didn't believe that, or just weren't bought in on the vision, or just were kind of distrustful of me as and there was a lot. Anyway,
Sure.
without getting into the details,
Of course.
there was a lot there. But part of the difficult thing was that some of the issues were personal. They were directed at me and not necessarily the work that we were doing. So that was really hard. That was really, really hard. So it's 2021, and I'm basically I'm like not getting out of bed most days for, like a month at this point. And not to say that everyone should go through this kind of rock bottom,
right?
But I was very, very lucky. So this is 21. So I'm 45 at this point. And, there's still nothing happening in the world. It's 21. And we built out a space for a studio. So I'm kind of going in there. And at some point, my wife is like, you don't have to like jump back into art. And I'm like, what else am I going to do? And she's like, you're allowed to go figure that out. I really didn't have a lot of resources for myself, but I had really great support from her and from coaches and other people in my life, friends. And so I spent that whole summer I actually created an exercise for myself that really kind of changed the game. And I have it up on my YouTube. It's called the Joy Compass. And I spent my time really thinking about, okay, well, what do I actually love doing? She was like, I don't think you want to make art. And I was like, I don't understand. I mean, that's what I've been doing for 10, 15 years. And I just had the biggest show of my life in December. Like, why would I not go back to art? She said, I don't think it was making you happy. Okay. And I'm grown up enough, and I've done enough of this work that I'm like, my absolute resistance to that idea means I should take a look.
Right.
I should go figure out what that resistance is. So I created this exercise, and you can see it and you can do it, but it's a way of sort of boiling down the things in your life that you like doing. And I mean that like in a very broad sense, everything, parenting and, and being with friends and work stuff. And I looked at that and I was like, so what's the common thread here? And it really looked a lot like, well, later I realized it looked a lot like coaching. And I was like, I want to help people. I want to work with people. That's what feels good. And there's more to the story. I applied to school for art therapy. But when I remember looking at coaching programs because they were less expensive, and it's just something I could kind of do while I was waiting for the art therapy school to say yes or no. And I went to an open house for my program. And I just remember they asked for a volunteer. I volunteered. They coached me for 5 minutes. And I just remember getting this like really great insight for myself. And I was like, okay, this is it. And when I started taking those classes, I just remember going, well, this is the work that I want to do. This is the way that I want to not only change people's lives, but if I can work with people who are going to activate their next chapter, if I'm going to work with people who are really ready to like look at and engage and find their joy and create that next chapter, whether it's art or activism, those are kind of like my two worlds a little bit. Mm-hmm. I get to be in the boat and have this ripple effect in a way that I could never do or at least that I didn't feel like I could do as an independent artist. Now there's people who are, but I just didn't feel like that was really my future. But this felt like I could do that. You can even see, like, you can hear it in my voice now.
Yeah.
I remember like getting into that. And so it was, I guess I started that in like I really started that in 2022. And I was coaching people professionally for money while I was still in the program. Because I have a lot of this background already and I was ready to start working with people. And I still feel lit up by the work. I still feel like I've had sessions this week. Like I feel more energized most of the time
Yep.
after those sessions than I did walking in.
So I hear your story and it reminds me of something that happened to me when I was in college. So I went to Northeastern University, which is built on the co-op program. At least when I was there, you go to school as a normal freshman, but then starting your sophomore year, you go year round. You're half the time in school and half the time working in a co-op. I chose Northeastern specifically so that I could co-op at the Boston Globe, because my entire goal was to not write for newspapers, but write for the Boston Globe. When I was 14 years old, sitting at my parents' house, my dad was a lifelong subscriber to the Globe, so I'd read it every day. And I went, aha, I'm going to write for the Boston Globe. So I chose my college, I did all my co-ops, and
Didn't
I,
know this.
by the time I was a senior, I love this. So Northeastern is a 5-year school. I took 6 because I added an abroad program. So I was a 6th-year senior and I got the coveted student reporter position. There was 2 of them in the newsroom. I spent 6 months as a general assignment reporter in the newsroom at the Boston Globe, working 2 to 10. And it was the most grueling thing I had ever done in my life. Even though I'm a natural by birth writer, I was not great in that high pressure situation. And when I graduated college, even though I would have been working for the Globe for 4.5 years by that time, they would have said, okay, kid, now go get some experience. This was the mid 90s. I would have had to gone to Quincy and worked at the Patriot Ledger for
Yeah.
$16,000 a year for 3 or 4 years before the
The
Globe
Ledger.
would consider taking me back. I'd have to go get my experience. So I got to the end of this road at being this student reporter, and I went, I don't want to do this. All this thing that I've been working towards for 10 years.
Yeah.
I don't want to do. And I was able at the time, even from the time, I was able to say, sort of shift this and say, you know what? No. This was my dream and I accomplished it. Check the box. I did it. Now it's time for a new dream. Rather than it was a failure. It wasn't a failure. It was absolutely a success. I did exactly what I set out to do. And it turned out that I found out a very important piece of information, which was I did not want to spend the next 5 years of my life doing what it would take to accomplish that ultimate dream. And so I was able to course correct in actually a really magical way, but it very similar, right? Like you think like the same thing with this artist's retreat for you, right? This is a dream. I want to do this. I want to change the world this way. And you get there and it falls apart, but you did it.
I did do it. We did run a number of retreats and they were great and they worked the way that we wanted them to. And I wish that we could have built more. But I really want to come back to what you said, which is, I think, really a really nice nugget for folks who are listening. When I took that job, I was walking away from art, but then I was going back to art. Then I was walking away from it again. It's like, okay, well, am I giving up? Am I quitting on this thing that was so important to me? And I feel like it's a thing that happens a lot where people don't realize that they're not following their dreams because they're following an old dream.
Yes.
And they're unwilling to update the journal on that. They're like, well, no, I haven't done everything that I thought was part of that. Well, okay, here's the thing. There's some very brilliant philosopher said that you start on the path and then the path reveals itself.
Yes.
So as you started on the path and you got the student thing and then you saw the path reveal itself and you were like, it's okay to say that, you know what, it's not like me with Myra, like, I was never a blue chip artist. I was, I'm not a household name. And that was, part of a dream at some point. And I have friends who are doing that and I see what it takes. And my joy comes from other things. And if I, again, you don't have to I hope no one has to hit rock bottom the way that I did to get there. But yeah, I feel like you have to be willing to update the manual.
Yes.
Right? And that's what midlife does for you.
Absolutely. And it just, you actually illustrated it so well because, right, you're talking about this impossible dream that you had and you wanted. But then when you were talking about finding coaching and going into coaching, your eyes lit up, your voice lit up. It was like, oh, the
Oh
dream
yeah.
you thought was the ultimate dream was actually only a step on the path towards the real dream.
Right. Right. I think that a lot of people, and I know this is a fact, a lot of people, when they do find the thing that they love doing, and usually that's through some amount of trial and error, informed trial and error, your
Yes.
midlife. It's not like you don't know anything about yourself.
Yeah.
But, one of the things I hear a lot is like, God, I wish I had been doing this for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And for the most part, that's a bunch of crap too. Like I
Right.
couldn't be doing what I'm doing when I was 27 instead of
Correct.
47. I don't think I could be doing it at 37.
Yeah.
It's all of those experiences, it's all of those pathways that let me step onto this one.
Yeah.
Now, are there other people who stepped onto a similar pathway earlier? Sure, but that wasn't my path. Now I can spend as much time as you want trying to figure out how I could have done it differently, but here I am. And this is what I love about the work that I do is, we can talk about that stuff. We're allowed to have our feelings about it. And then what do we want to create from this place?
Yeah.
Here's the resources you have. Here are the things within your control. Here are the options ahead of you. What's the best, or as the designing your life folks say, what's the best doable option for you?
Yep. Yeah. Oh, Mark, I love this story. I feel like you and I could probably go nerdy on this for multiple more hours, but I've promised to only take up so much of your time, and our listeners probably want to see the elegant closure of this conversation as
See the
well.
end of the
So,
yellow brick road. I would love it if people who are listening did leave you comments and say,
yeah.
if there's stuff that they want to hear more about so that you can have those conversations. I want to encourage people to be engage on your podcast is what I'm saying.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I try to do that as well, but I think all the encouragement that we can give is useful. Before I let you go, we mentioned briefly in the middle that I'm going to show up as a guest on your podcast in the coming weeks. Remind us where that is and where it can be found.
You can find all of my stuff at my website at Marc Scheff Coaching. So MarcScheff coaching.com. All of my stuff is on there. If you go to markscheffcoaching.com/links, that's probably just the best place if you just want to jump off to other things. So the
Perfect.
podcast is called The Art of Transformation. That's on most places you listen to podcasts. It's also, I have a Substack, which is like a separate thing, same name.
Yep.
But Marc Scheff Coaching, if you remember nothing else, that's where you can find. I try to keep everything at least up to date there, so you can find your way to if you want to listen or read or whatever you want to do.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, Mark, thanks so much for spending this time with me and for being so generous in your story and really digging through that midlife transition with me today.
Yeah, glad to. It's really fun, and I'm looking forward to releasing your podcast out there as well. I don't know what's going to come first, but I'm excited for everyone to listen to both because we had a great talk already, and we're going over time on this one. I feel like
Right. For you and I, this is part 2 of our conversation. So
exactly.
you're exactly right. People might need to listen to both of them.
You're going to have to listen to both, everybody. You have to go listen to the podcast. Thank
I
you so
love
much
it.
for that support, and thank you for having me today. This was wonderful.
Thanks so much for listening today. There was so much good stuff in this conversation. I'm spinning about which threads to pick out first. Let's start with the concept of dreams and following an old dream versus updating the path. Mark and I both had experiences where we had these huge dreams that we actually achieved, but that turned out to be way different than what we had hoped for or expected. And I think that's a really important thread to pull at because so many of us have those dreams. And it's during this transition into midlife that we find out that the dreams that we had, whether it was getting that important job, getting married, having the family, having that particular career you wanted in high school or college, it's at this time of our lives that these dreams can start to feel like they no longer fit. And that can be enormously scary. And it's really the basis for this thing that I call the ick. It's like something doesn't fit anymore and you're not quite sure what to do about it. But if we're honest with ourselves, it's wildly freeing to do what Mark and I both did, which is to say, yes, I did it. I accomplished that dream. And then to acknowledge that it didn't look or feel or fit like you hoped it would, and that adjusting the dream is not an admission of failure. Some dreams were meant to be stepping stones to get to something else. I have a situation like this in my life right at this very moment that I will share with you more about after the holidays. So let's let go of the stigma that not sticking with something for life is a failure. And yes, I even mean marriages. Not that I'm a huge pro or anything, but sometimes people get married young and they evolve and grow over time. And as they do that, they become less compatible with each other because they've evolved into different people who are interested in different things. And that's okay. It's okay if you want to renegotiate the terms of the relationship to make it work for the new you. And it's also okay if you want to choose a different path. And I know, I'm really out on a limb here, and I hope I'm not being too provocative, but sometimes achieving one dream is a stepping stone to something even better that you could not have even imagined before you achieved that first dream. So I want you to take a moment and think, is there a dream or a goal in your life that you've outgrown? It could be something you've reached or accomplished, or it could be one that you're still working towards and you've decided that in the working towards it, it doesn't really fit anymore. Now take a minute and think, how would it feel to do what Mark says and update the manual and let that create space for a new dream? What if you took a little bit of time to reflect on whether you're holding on to an outdated dream? Because it's important to periodically take stock of what it is that brings you joy and fulfillment, and then align things in your life around that. And I think that's a really natural segue into the part of the conversation where Mark and I talked about the role of intuition and inner voices. And it's so interesting to me that this entry point into midlife is the time where the noise of the societal shoulds begins to get quiet and our own intuition begins to get louder. In so many of these conversations, I have heard stories of the power of listening to those inner voices, the gut feelings, the instincts, or the moments of clarity that often guide us during these transitional periods. But first, we have to stop ignoring the voices and actually tune into them. And that happens differently for everyone. For a lot of people, it's meditation and it's journaling. And I know even saying that is turning some of you off, but it doesn't have to be that. It could be when you take a walk, you get inspiration and ideas. It could be while you're working out. It could be while you're commuting. I almost said communing, but there's that too. I swear I get my best ideas when I'm blow drying my hair. Whatever it is you can do to quiet the noise of the world and give your insides a chance to send up a signal and throw you a line. Anyone? Billy Joel fans here? That just came flying out of my mouth. But for real, when was the last time you tuned into your gut instinct? And what did it tell you? And did you have the courage to follow it? I would be really curious to hear the answers to those questions. And the last thing I want to pull out of this conversation, speaking of courage, is the importance of having the courage to be a beginner again. Mark talked about what it was like to start jujitsu at 41, and I started my aerial silks pursuit when I was 40. And neither of these endeavors was easy, but being a beginner, which you may have to do once you've created space for a new dream and then tuned into your intuition for direction. Being a beginner builds resilience, it builds humility, and it gives you new energy. It gives you excitement. It brings something into your life to look forward to and to work on and to work at, something that changes the face of the day to day. Learning something new is really a great way to keep our brains sharp, keeps us growing and vibrant. And P.S., no matter what it is never too late to start. So don't give me that BS. I literally today, while taking an Instagram break, read procrastinating, saw a post that said the following. It was one of these back and forth posts. I posted it on my stories yesterday. The account is I am 30AF, a favorite of mine. And the post said this: reminder that 30 isn't old. It's very normal not to accomplish everything in your 20s, and that it is never too late to learn the thing you've always wanted to learn. You're always growing. That's a good thing. Guy 2 says, who the hell accomplishes everything in their 20s? Who made that a thing? I was 48 when I started my apprenticeship to become a tattoo artist. I was 50 when I married the love of my life. You've got time. Guy 3 says, I didn't get my first book published until I was 38. At 53, I'm about to sign a contract for my 10th. You have time. I just think that is so kismet. So now we've got that established. What is something new you've always wanted to try but felt it was too late to start? And could now be the time to give it a shot? New year, new start, new things, new beginnings. I'm just saying. All right, next week you're going to meet Philip Blackett, who just turned 40 and is a recovering people pleaser. He didn't have a solid foundation at home as a kid, which left voids that he thinks played a role in him wanting to appease people and made him afraid of conflict and confrontation. He talks about changing elements of himself to earn the conditional love from people he later realized never did love him. And now he's writing a new chapter. Can't wait to share this one with you. So I'll see you next week. The 40 Drinks podcast is produced and presented by Savoir Faire Marketing Communications.